A Bitter Taste by Purefoy's Girl. Chapter 10.
You get me?
There was a split second of thrilling anticipation, followed by the inevitable realization that it was finite. Hannibal was no immortal like himself. He had risen to the peak of his prime and was starting to eye the road down in the distance. Perhaps, had Will found him 20 years before, it would have made a difference, but that was foolish to even think of. They were here, now, and he would move on sooner rather than later, leaving Hannibal behind however he could manage to do so. It put a fine edge of desperation in his lunging kiss, a sharp insistence driving him to near panic. He tasted copper on his lips and lapped it greedily, some essence of Hannibal's life-blood making it richer, warmer, more addictive than it had a right to be.
Will,
he said, his bleeding mouth brushing Will's, moving beneath his lapping tongue.
You've gone ahead of me, haven't you?
Yes, he said, his voice husky, his hands twisting between them to rake up Hannibal's chest and find his shoulder, blunt nails digging in hard. He felt Hannibal wince against his onslaught, but the man never once indicated he should stop.
You weren't there,
he said, pushing against him. Hannibal rolled with the movement, letting Will rear over him, seized with the desire to devour him whole and somehow save him from his empty future.
And that bothers you?
Hannibal asked him, stroking Will's back with both warm hands, unresisting beneath him.
Yes, it bothers me,
Will snarled, pressing his face against Hannibal's throat, feeling the thrumming pulse just beneath the skin, fluttering against his lips.
It's a crooked deal, Hannibal. My everything for your limited lifespan. I lose on that one.
He already knew what was to come. He knew very little about Hannibal's thoughts, but it was a reasonable expectation, a natural next step to name it.
You could change me, Will,
Hannibal said, and Will suppressed a soft, knowing smile. He breathed easily and softly despite the weight of Will atop him. His fingers traced the stark, bunched muscle of Will's arms and swept down his sides, waking a spill of goose flesh with his touch.
You could ask me your question, do for me, as the raven stag did for you.
No, he whispered, placing a kiss where a bite had been intended. He could feel Hannibal's heart pounding, the ripple of his belly as he breathed. Will shoved at the bedclothes and hitched his leg over Hannibal's hips, straddling him, sitting up to settle himself firmly over Hannibal's groin.
No. No, you cannot, or no, you will not.
Will studied him, perched on him like a lithe, pale incubus, fingers tracing absent trails on Hannibal's hard belly.
No, I cannot,
he carefully said.
I don't remember how it was done to me. I can't do it to you. Does that give you incentive, Will?
Hannibal inquired, content to stack his hands behind his head and merely look at him. His appreciation took physical form beneath Will's round bottom, but neither of them acknowledged it.
The idea of taking more than a mortal lifetime to get your end of the bargain in full?
You just want immortality, Will said, a soft laugh forcing its way from between his lips. His teeth gleamed in the darkness, white and sharp and fully descended.
Is that such a terrible thing?
It is for me, Will said, solemn once more.
Because you are alone and you're forever, Will,
Hannibal reminded him, noting the almost imperceptible slump of his straight shoulders.
You don't have to be.
Will frowned, mulling that over. Hannibal was blatantly manipulating him, which meant he didn't care if Will knew it, which meant it was probably honest.
That's a pretty strong commitment to someone you don't know,
he said at last, making the leap before him, reversing the image to see things through Hannibal's eyes. For the first time in a long time outside of a hunt, the perception that had plagued him as a human reared its head in full once more, and the reversed image solidified. With absolute certainty he knew why Hannibal would seek immortality, how he would use it, what ends he would seek.
Self-preservation is a strong motivator,
Hannibal said, smiling slightly.
As well you know.
Will swallowed. He used both hands to trace the dome of Hannibal's slight belly, fingers wringing his belly button where a narrow strip of hair began to widen as it swept downward.
Is it so outlandish to think that I would gladly trade the rest of my mortal life for an immortal one?
Hannibal asked, giving him that to chew on.
Perhaps when you remember what the Raven Stag did to you, Will, you will find that you made the very same choice, and my own will seem much more acceptable to you.
I already understand, Will murmured, because he did. It was as simple as breathing, shifting to Hannibal's perspective, seeing his reasons and the future as Hannibal did. He absolutely knew that he wouldn't be there. It was only a commitment insofar as Will was complicit in his own ignorance, and he was far too old for that now.
How would you do it?
He asked, sweeping his hands up to Hannibal's chest, stretching out over him like a warm, calculating cat.
Slowly,
Hannibal told him, sliding one hand out from under his head to cup Will's cheek.
As you would prefer.
Will's lids drooped, his mind conjuring the moment it would happen. There would be a test to ensure the transformation had taken, and then Hannibal would turn on his maker and consume him.
I'd still be immortal,
he murmured, tipping his head down, shifting his weight onto his backside against the fullness in Hannibal's groin.
With you forever. What would you take last, Hannibal?
Hannibal's hand grazed down to press over Will's chest. His voice was absent and distracted when he said,
Your heart, of course.
Will shuddered, taken with the idea. He would be transformed and elevated, devoured bit by bit, with his still beating heart taken last, making him forever a part of a man who would wield immortality like the weapon it was meant to be.
Does that frighten you?
No, Will said, immediate and firm.
I understand it, and that informs me. But it doesn't frighten me, Hannibal. There isn't much that truly does anymore. Not deeply, anyway. Allow me to try,
Hannibal offered, grasping his wrist suddenly in a bruising grip, shifting with sudden, controlled violence to twist Will beneath him, compliant and alert.
Try all you like,
Will breathlessly said, his thighs parting to cradle the press of Hannibal's hips, the man's full weight bearing down on him. He tugged to test the strength of the grip on his wrists, and his breath caught again when he felt the thrill of being well and truly pinned. He knew he could break Hannibal's hold if he wanted to, by employing his unnatural strength, and it was just that certainty that Hannibal was relying on if things got to be too much. He had an astounding amount of faith in Will's desire to save himself.
Use your gift on me, Will,
Hannibal purred, transferring Will's wrist from his left hand to hold both in his right. Free now, he tangled his fingers in Will's hair and gave a hard, steady tug that made him wince, teeth bared.
Turn it into a weapon to protect yourself. That's not what it would be,
Will gasped, stars bursting on the edges of his vision, his rushing blood flooding his groin with painful heat. He laughed, delighted, and knew with sudden clarity.
It would protect you.
It was not desire to share himself that prompted Hannibal's urging, but a desire to see Will helplessly ensnared in him. Hannibal's response was to suck a bite mark on his bared neck, only lifting his head when Will grew taut with tension beneath him. His hand found the mark on Will's hip and covered it, exploring the sensitive edges with a vague threat of causing him real pain ever lingering in the warmth of his touch. He unexpectedly released Will's wrists and slid down his body to lave the mark with his tongue, even that gentle probing enough to make Will catch his breath.
No one's ever left a mark on me before,
Will said, the words escaping in a broken jumble. His hand knotted in Hannibal's hair, ready to pull if his tongue pushed too hard. His hard cock jostled with each word he spoke, so close to his touch but so far.
Why can you allow me to?
Hannibal purred, his attention shifting to Will's trembling belly, where he gripped him hard as he sat up, arching Will's back to his satisfaction, arranging him like a display. He was panting, hair falling over his brow and a slight sheen of sweat shining over his skin. He traced a line from Will's breastbone down his belly with one manicured fingernail, right to where the straining tip of his cock lay restlessly pulsing. Will took a dragging breath, shuddering hard because he knew. In that moment Hannibal was imagining him split open, warm innards bared to him, seeking in flesh those secrets that Will's mouth had not yet offered up.
"And what are your walls made of, Hannibal?"
he asked, the words jagged, cutting glass, sharp enough that Hannibal flinched. Blood and bone and determination. The understanding that there's no one, not a single soul, worthy of knowing you completely. Hannibal stared down at him. When his smile came, it was cruel and cold, and Will licked his lips with anticipation, wondering how it would manifest in his touch. He would heal, eventually, whatever was done to him. He wasn't even entirely sure that Hannibal taking his heart would truly kill him. Not for good. He was unknown chaotic destruction, barely leashed by his own civility, held in check only by the remnants of the empathy that had plagued his human lifetime.
That wicked little tongue of yours, Ganymede,
Hannibal said, his voice husky and harsh.
Should be careful what it says.
Is that something you're withholding, Hannibal? Will asked, reckless in his curiosity. Or was your bargaining just a castle in the air? Hannibal's hands spread over Will's thighs, sliding beneath to hitch them up, knees bent and slender feet braced.
I always keep my promises, Will,
he whispered, dropping over him to brace on his stiff arms, gazing down into Will's excited face.
One of these days you'll know me as well as you know yourself.
Will laughed, the irony not lost on him, but he didn't care. He really couldn't give less of a fuck. His heart was pounding, his skin twitched with sensation as he was buffeted by excitement, delight, and even that biting fear by turns. It was a heady mixture he wasn't about to forfeit for a half-truth. Whatever it was that danced over his skin like electricity must surely be madness, because he was willingly staying in the keeping of a man who had shown he could and would hurt him without hesitation or compunction. Perhaps he was truly insane after all? If so, he embraced it with the same furious hunger that he embraced the man descending on him. Hannibal's hands found his neck, fingers curling beneath to tilt his head, baring his throat. Will eagerly tipped his head back farther, utter compliance, his whole body jerking in response to that brush of lips down the column of his throat, the ravenous press of teeth with every potential to crush his windpipe. He shuddered and arched into it, hands scrabbling to clutch Hannibal's broad shoulders, pulling him closer, urging him on. When the bite did finally come, it tore a throaty moan from his parted lips, his hips arching up on instinct, pushing for friction and finding it in the press of Hannibal's warm weight between his legs. He could kill me. But he wouldn't. Will knew that as surely as he knew that after this tryst he would do anything necessary to remember what the raven stag had done to him. Anything to please the dangerous beast moving over him, even if it meant that his heart would be eaten from his chest like a cherry plucked from a tree. And he would do it because he'd finally found something interesting in the world. Something that promised the end of boredom, however things turned out. "I'm not as easy to break as I look," he promised, his teeth aching to sink into something fully descended, lupine and sharp.
"I have very few assumptions about you, Ganymede."
Hannibal shrugged his shoulders, shifting Will's hands down. He felt blood smear beneath his touch and realized he'd dug in too deeply. But it didn't matter, because Hannibal's mouth was seeking lower, tongue and lips tracing the same trails Alana's had as if to erase the memory of her touch on his skin. Will clutched at him, locking his corded thighs around Hannibal's hips to keep him from gaining any space between them. He arched over Will with nimble grace, supple and sleek as he tasted the soft skin of his nipples, the salty skin stretching beneath his arms, bit to test the depth just over his sternum, where his heart fluttered like a caged wild thing, ready to burst with excitement. He sat up suddenly on his knees, Will's body bent to accommodate him, slender back bowed and his limpid eyes glittering. Hannibal gazed down the length of Will's pale slim body, panting and calculating. Will lowered his lids just slightly, a parody of the demure, and deliberately parted his lips as if he was going to speak. A flush suffused him when Hannibal's eyes fastened on the movement, fixed on Will's angelic face written with nothing less than an absolute desire to be soiled beyond redemption. His cock twitched in a hard surge against Will's sensitive skin. He grinned and purred.
"Even knowing what this is, I'm unwilling to resist."
"So was Zeus," Will said, his full mouth curving on a smile. He tightened his legs around Hannibal's hips and pulled, an undulation that poured up his body with liquid grace, unrepentingly inviting. Hannibal was eager enough to be seduced, willing enough to test the muscles of Will's thighs with his fingers and part them. Now that Will was shaken from making a game of his seduction, Hannibal was perfectly content to explore him in depth, his dark eyes bottomless holes that greedily devoured every tiny detail of the body beneath him. It drove Will to distraction, that hunger, that clinical observation. He wasn't content to be the only monster set on fire in this bed. He much preferred to burn together. "Stop fucking thinking!" he snarled, moving suddenly to sit up, snatching Hannibal's wrists in his hands and wrenching his arms out. It left the man exposed for a bare split second, long enough for Will to place a biting kiss beneath his jaw, growling softly with irritation. Hannibal twisted on instinct, breaking Will's hold and gaining his own, one large hand on his nape and the other on his shoulder, the tender prelude to a snapped neck. He stared down into Will's upturned face, and Will swore for just a moment he saw his reflection in his amber eyes, flushed cheeks and parted lips, eyes sultry and half-mad, suspended somewhere between angel and demon, with every capability to be either on his whim. "I'm not yours, Hannibal," he panted and grinned. "You can't dissect me from my secrets or bleed the truth from me. How does that make you feel?" The hand tightened on his neck at the jibe, vaguely threatening. When he pushed back against it, lean body arching forward against Hannibal's, he got a flicker of pure fire from those gleaming eyes and laughed. "What do you want, Dr. Lecter?" he breathed, the pressure of Hannibal's cock against his own acutely pleasurable. He wet his lips with the tip of his tongue and lowered his lids further, veiling his eyes behind his thick, dark lashes. "Or would you rather I tell you what I want?" "No," Hannibal said, the barest tremor to the word. His voice was strong but unsteady when he said, "What you want is irrelevant, Will. What matters is what I'm going to do to you, and how much you're willing to take." Will laughed again, shuddering hard, grasping at this fear and excitement that just kept hitting him in growing waves. His delight made him dizzy, stole his composure, and pared him down to something even more savage than the monster who devoured the helpless. He was still laughing when Hannibal bent him backwards, bowing his back so hard he had a heady moment when he thought his spine might snap. But he was limber and supple, and a quick shift of his knees brought him flat on the bed, his hands dragging Hannibal to him, their mouths meeting in a brutal approximation of a kiss. Those warm hands swept down his back and cupped his round ass, squeezing him up tight. He rocked with the movement, seeking friction, his breath stuttering and harsh, lean belly smeared with pre-cum. Hannibal tasted like blood and wine, his tongue plunging into Will's mouth with such force he nearly bit him. He moaned when his sore, unhealed lower lip was sucked between Hannibal's sharp teeth, but his violence was under tight and absolute control. No unintended pain planned, and instead the raw places where Hannibal's teeth had pierced him were softly laved with a kiss. "I don't want that," Will gasped, tossing his head. He was immediately and forcibly shaken by the scruff just once, just hard enough that his teeth clicked together. Angrily he snarled, "I don't want your kindness, Hannibal." The grip on his nape slid to his hair, and Hannibal's fingers fisted painfully. Will thrashed in his grip, resenting the other hand that took hold of his chin and made him look directly up into Hannibal's handsome face. Oh, there was fire there now. Those eyes fairly danced with it. Fire and cruelty and something that might have been hope, though for what, Will couldn't imagine. Hannibal smiled just slightly, and Will wanted to kiss him again, to feel his warm, wet lips and sharp, frightening teeth on his other hip, setting a mark to match the first. "You want what I tell you to want," Hannibal purred, deceptively soft. He pressed his thumb just beneath Will's lip, his fingers curling beneath his chin in a soft stroke. "When I tell you to want it. Lie however you're comfortable. Nude, of course. Kindly clean up the dining room before you dress." Will fought his grip, heedless of the pain, but he wasn't fighting to get away. He was fighting because it felt good to finally have something that would resist him. but it didn't feel half as good as having Hannibal smile wickedly at him, knowing already what he needed and how he needed it.
"It's nearly done,"
Hannibal said, his tone conversational, his touch downright devilish when his fingers moved from Will's chin to trace a trail down his body.
"I wonder how quickly I can manage to unmake you."
Will's breath came out in a staccato of half-curses when Hannibal's fingers swiftly cupped him. He jerked in the man's grip, eyes rolling with the pure sensation of it. Somehow that intoxicating awareness of Hannibal grew teeth and bit into his nerves. He arched into the touch and snarled, wanting more.
"Emotional abstinence has certainly left you starving,"
Hannibal purred, his hold on Will's hair pulling, forcing his head back into the pillow to bare his throat once more.
"Good thing you enjoy feeding things,"
Will brokenly said, clutching his shoulders, unashamedly trying to fuck the hand so teasingly fondle him. He hissed a fluid, impressive curse that made Hannibal chuckle.
"I must admit, Will, seeing you starving in this capacity is infinitely gratifying,"
he said, letting go of Will's hair and his cock, leaving him splayed out on his bed in a resentful, beautiful heap. The room was suddenly lighter, dawn creeping in through the cracks and revealing Hannibal's handsome face in full. Even in the softest of lights his cheekbones were stark, his mouth perfectly shaped and stern, lending him a dignity that didn't fail no matter that he was naked and disheveled and alarmingly aroused. Hannibal cocked his head, observing him, and Will asked,
"You're thinking about what you want me to want, Dr. Lecter?"
"No," he said, absorbed.
"I'm thinking about canceling my appointments today to deal with you."
Will grinned. When he trailed his hand down his belly to take himself in hand, Hannibal suddenly caught his wrist and stopped him. Will didn't resist when he was settled back, dragging him along by the grip on his wrist. Even reclining at the wrong end of his bed, he was noble as a king, his dark eyes shuttered and secure in what he wanted.
"Open your mouth."
Defiant only for the split second it took him to flash Hannibal a sultry glare, Will slowly wet his lips and opened his mouth. Dark eyes held as Hannibal touched his lips, his fingers dipping into Will's mouth to caress his sharp lupine teeth.
"If you draw blood,"
he softly said, hooking his finger behind one thick fang to draw Will nearer,
"we'll discover together if the pieces cut off of you grow back by morning."
Will didn't answer. His tongue curled around Hannibal's fingers and he sucked on them, slowly drawing back. He didn't need to be told. He drew his spread knees up and bent forward, hands steadying on Hannibal's thighs. It didn't feel like the first time doing this, didn't feel strange or alarming when he darted his tongue out to taste the tip of the man's heavy cock. Musky and wet, pearly precum, salty, thick, and sticky. The skin was incredibly soft beneath the trailing touch of his tongue, responsive to even his harsh breathing. Will closed his eyes and carefully drew the full head into his mouth, cautious of his sharp teeth. The shudder that racked him echoed in Hannibal's body, and he felt fingers twining in his curls. Not tugging now, not guiding, just petting him so that goose flesh chased down his back and arms. He added pressure with his cheeks, decades of being on the receiving end coming to his aid. His wet tongue slid out, trailing further down the length of him as he tested his own gag reflex. Turned out he didn't have one. His nose flattened to Hannibal's groin, and the man actually groaned, arching slightly into him, the long fat length of his cock contracting hard down Will's throat. He swallowed and swallowed, shivering, lids fluttering. It was suffocating and incredibly powerful, a keen, strange pleasure all on its own, a penetration he hadn't considered, but realized he wanted more of. God, he wanted to bite down, to taste the blood swelling Hannibal's cock to delightful proportions. He wanted to sink his teeth in and feel him twitch, feel him come helplessly. Will pushed harder, lips fastening around the base, hoping against hope to win another groan out of him. He might just come all over himself if he did, and he didn't give a damn. He'd been deprived for too long to deny himself anything now, no matter how quick and hard it might be. Hannibal released a long, throaty sigh, kneading Will's nape, sweeping his palm up against his curls in a warm caress. Will caught suction and pulled up, a soft, helpless moan escaping around the thick flesh in his mouth, to feel it sliding from between his lips, silky, hot, and throbbing. He wanted to do it again, swallow him all the way down, feel the pulse of him deep down in his throat, and the frantic spasm as he came. But Hannibal tugged on his hair then, holding him from doing more. Languid now, strangely satisfied by it, Will licked his lips and swallowed hard, surprised when Hannibal suddenly dragged him up by his shoulders and kissed him. It was the most undone he'd seen him yet, his calculation lost to urgency, finally helpless against desire, as so many others had been in Will's life. But the control was still there, violence restrained and maddeningly so, even as he bodily slung Will around onto his hands and knees with lithe, tense grace.
Was my tongue better suited to that, Hannibal?
Will asked, laughing breathlessly, still tasting the thick, salty flesh in his mouth.
I would say so,
Hannibal said, the words clipped and tight as he crowded close. Still panting, Will twisted around to look at him, shuddering to see him so utterly unfettered. He was pouring something onto his hand, and Will bit his lip when that same hand slid between his cheeks.
Open,
Hannibal ordered, slapping first one inner thigh, then the other to make Will comply. He did so, head hanging, shivering in spasms, when Hannibal's slick fingers expertly teased into him. It forced a shocked sob from him, harsh and desperate. He grabbed the nearest pillow and hugged it underneath his chin, biting the corner. Those fingers weren't gentle or cautious, but Will didn't need them to be. His body gave with the motion, greedy for more, almost like he'd done this before, though he would certainly have remembered. In and out, slick and fast, twisting, 2 fingers then 3, and Will wasn't entirely sure he couldn't take more. It was a thought that made him snarl into the pillow, his dribbling cock bouncing in response. Hannibal crooned at him, making that soft sound like he had in his office, chastising him as if he was a cat. He didn't warn him, just gripped Will's hip, right over the mark he'd left, no accident in its placement, and fed the swollen tip of his cock in along his slick fingers. Will jerked beneath him, trembling hard, feeling Hannibal's fingers slide out of him as his cock slid in. Spots danced before his eyes, and his breath came out in a gasping rush. He twitched hard and tipped his hips up on impulse, sobbing as Hannibal settled deep. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The whole of his body and mind was clenched tight around the hot, thick flesh inside him. He hadn't counted on it feeling good, on liking it, on anything. But Hannibal gripped his hips in both strong hands, shifted Will's body to bow prettily beneath him, and put the full force of his powerful hips beneath his next thrust. All Will could do was relax into it, moaning senselessly, every pummeling crack of Hannibal's hips against his ass sending a shockwave through him so rough and fast that Will's cock slapped up hard against his belly, splattering pre-cum over his skin with each stroke. Hannibal panted behind him, working him furiously to just the edge of pain, moving Will's compliant body to suit his own needs, Will's pleasure rendered incidental. So why was he moaning over and over, fuck me, oh God, fuck me? He didn't even recognize the words at first, that they were coming out of him, the pillow forsaken. Luckily for him, Hannibal had no intentions of stopping, didn't even pause when Will's legs gave out underneath him. He just tightened his grip on Will's slim hips and tilted him up tighter, a piston of hard flesh inside of him, riding him along the fine cusp of pain until Will bucked in his grasp, going tight and rigid beneath him. Will lunged in sudden, breathless climax, his orgasm drawing him into a taut line, clenching around Hannibal's deep thrust, cock bouncing wildly, seeking friction as he spurted viscous ropes of cum onto Hannibal's pristine sheets. He was gasping and moaning and couldn't muster the energy to feel embarrassed by the way he begged, wanting it to stop and wanting it to last forever. It was so keenly satisfying and frustrating all at the same time, bursting into orgasm without a single touch to his throbbing cock. Tension gave way to boneless release. Hannibal paused long enough to shift behind him, sliding backwards to settle Will astride him. Holy fuck, he moaned, panting, centuries of vocabulary eluding him in the face of one very good orgasm. Oh God, wait, Hannibal, He cut off on a hiss of indrawn breath when Hannibal tucked up around him, balls deep and rocking, one arm locked around Will's chest, his free hand dropping to wrap around Will's spent cock. He squeezed down around him reflexively, sobbing, when Hannibal managed to coax him back to full salute, and it was so delightfully painful, his cock so achingly sensitive, that he squirmed helplessly in another hard, dry orgasm, suspended in the throes of that white-hot line where pain and pleasure looped in on themselves with vicious effect. He was so lost in the agonizing pleasure of it that Hannibal's own orgasm came as a surprise. Will uttered a soft, moaned complaint when the man arched up hard into him, the hard spasm of his cock pulsing and pushing inside of him. A shudder racked Hannibal's warm body, and Will echoed it, trying to curl protectively around his spent sex and the relentless slick pull of Hannibal's trembling hand. Hannibal slowed to a stop, panting harshly behind him, both of them sweaty and breathless. Will could feel it starting to seep out of him around the thick flesh still buried to the balls in his ass. He wondered if Hannibal would be appalled when he pulled out.
"Ganymede,"
Hannibal said, breathless, dropping a sudden and surprising kiss onto Will's sweaty nape.
"You truly could stop even a god in his tracks, Will."
Will smiled, tired and spent, softening in more ways than one. He was limply unresisting when Hannibal shifted him, pulling out in a gush of spent sex and expensive lube. Considering the way he needed Will's backside when Will slid forward, he certainly wasn't appalled.
"Will?"
he asked, moving to sit next to him, lean belly caving with every breath, one large hand stroking Will's sweaty, smooth back.
"I'm fine,"
Will panted, answering the unspoken inquiry.
"Tired, but I'll live."
Hannibal's eyes sparkled with amusement at that. With a sharp, delighted smile, he purred,
"I would count that as a win, were I you."